Ukraine would be willing to accept a ceasefire, some form of pause in hostilities based along the current lines of control. What they're not going to do is they're not going to give Russia territory that they've been fighting over for the last 3 years, and that Russia has not been able to conquer. They're not going to give Russia territory which would give it an advantage in the almost certain event that Russia restarts this war at a later date. So, yeah, I mean, if Trump wants to be remembered as something worse than, Neville Chamberlain, waving a piece of paper saying peace in our time, then he should carry on.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Jimmy Rushton on the show. He's a Kyiv-based journalist and a foreign policy and security expert. We've spoken about what's really happening inside Ukraine right now. Russia claims to have broken through some front lines. The fact that Ukraine has then pushed back and said, no, that does not represent true facts. So we speak about that. And then on a separate note, we also speak about, of course, this meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin taking place this Friday. So we get the inside analysis from Jimmy when it comes to what areas Ukraine might have to give up, what they're willing to give up, because Vladimir Zelensky has always said that he wouldn't give up any territory to Russia. So we speak all about that, what we can expect from Putin and what we can expect from Donald Trump, how he's going to play this meeting on Friday. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Jimmy Rushton, a Kyiv-based journalist and a foreign policy and security expert. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get into what's happening with the Trump and Putin meeting on Friday, but just kick off, I want to get a run through from you as someone on the ground of what's really happening in Ukraine. Now, Russia is claiming that they've broken through front lines near Pokrovsk, but Ukraine has said that does not reflect real facts. So is there an updated story on what really has happened?
Yeah, so the situation is quite fluid, quite chaotic, and there is definitely a penetration of the Ukrainian lines. I wouldn't say it's a breakthrough. What we're seeing is large numbers of small groups of Russian infantry which managed to penetrate the lines. They exploited gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. They exploited the Ukrainian lack of manpower on the front line in that sector, and they managed to push through. They are seeming to attempt to outflank Dobropilia, which is a city to the north of Pokrovsk. And it's a concerning situation for the Ukrainians for sure, but it's not quite the breakthrough that some people are reporting it as, and it's definitely not a case that these troops have seized land. They are just kind of roaming around, causing chaos, and making a nuisance of themselves, and it is something the Ukrainians need to deal with.
So the soldiers, the Russian soldiers on the ground are definitely not as experienced as the Ukrainian ones, are they?
It really depends which unit you're talking about, but generally that's true, yes. Most of especially the assault troops, which Russians use as expendable stormtroopers, really, they give them maybe a couple of days training. If that, push them towards the Ukrainian lines, the vast majority of them get killed, but maybe say 5% survive, and then they dig in, and then they wait for reinforcements to come. So it's a brutally inefficient way of waging war, but the Russians have the manpower at the moment to use that method of waging war. And the Ukrainians really, they don't have the manpower to effectively, defend all of the areas of the front to the extent that they would like to, unfortunately.
Jimmy, in terms of the gains that Ukrainian army has made, it does seem like fighting has no sign of slowing down with these negotiations and talks happening this week. But the Ukrainian army said that they struck a Russian oil refinery earlier this week and that they had taken back a village in Sumy. Can you run me through the gains that they've made in the last week or so?
Yeah, so they have been more successful in Sumy, which is a region north of Ukraine. They've been pushing the Russians back there, but it's been relatively minor successes. In terms of the strike on the Russian oil refinery, there have actually been more than one, and the Ukrainian drone program has been relatively effective in that regard. They've started striking Russian energy infrastructure, oil refineries, oil storage depots, again, they stopped for quite a while. There was a suspicion that they'd stopped because the Americans had asked them to, but they seem to have the green light again. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Americans are making a lot of noise about not buying Russian oil. He slapped tariffs, 25% on tariff on India, because apparently the Indians are buying a lot of Russian oil, which they're then reselling at a massive profit. And the Americans would like people to buy American oil and not Russian oil. And they've struck a number of other military industrial targets across Russia. It's the drone program's relatively successful. But fighting is very, very fierce across the front line, and in the Donbass and Donetsk, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians right now. The Russians are, in my opinion, they're trying to push as hard as they can before the talks. They're trying to essentially create facts on the ground, so to speak. And I think they are using a lot of resources to advance as quickly as possible before Trump and Putin sit down in Alaska.
Well, speaking of the meeting, we'll get into that. The meetings between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, the first face-to-face meeting they've had since the war began, especially, of course, since Trump was inaugurated in January. But Trump told reporters on Monday that we're going to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and probably for the first 2 minutes, I'll know exactly whether or not a deal can be made. I'm going to speak to Putin. I'm going to tell him that you've got to end the war and that he would like to see a ceasefire very, very quickly. Jimmy, what is the consensus on the ground? Does anyone think that he can do this?
Not really. I think that the problem is that both sides still have very, very different positions as to what they would accept for a ceasefire to come into force. So for the Ukrainians, they would actually accept a ceasefire based on current lines of control. Whereas for the Russians, they've repeatedly said that the Ukrainians have to withdraw from the 4 oblasts that Russia claims to have annexed in their entirety. So Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. Zaporizhia and Kherson, the Ukrainians control close to half of those oblasts. They also control the regional capitals of Kherson and Zaporizhia, so there's no chance the Ukrainians are going to withdraw from those regions. If they did withdraw, particularly from Kherson Oblast, it would give the Russians a very, very advantageous position on the wrong side of the river, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. And if Russia restarted the war, you wouldn't have that, perfect defensive feature of the terrain, that massive river, the Dnipro River, which would otherwise prevent the Russians from driving to Odessa. It would give the Russians a huge advantage. So they're just not going to do that. It's as simple as that. So I don't think that we're anywhere close to a ceasefire and definitely nowhere near political agreement to end this war, unfortunately.
Vladimir Zelensky said he obviously wants to be at the meeting with Trump and Putin, something that European leaders and NATO members have backed up. Trump said that he would still like to see a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, but he also said that I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying I have to get constitutional approval. He has approval to go to the war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap because there will be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody. He obviously means that this land swap that he suggested would have to go through the Ukraine constitution. But the idea that Trump would agree to a land swap, Jimmy, when there's nothing for Ukraine to swap in terms of what they would get back from Russia is a little bit startling. Do you think that Donald Trump will be selling Ukraine out?
If he tries to force Ukraine to give up territory, especially territory that isn't currently occupied by Russia, for sure. It's just a very stupid statement, to be honest. It's completely ignorant of the realities on the ground. Look, Ukraine would be willing to accept a ceasefire, some form of pause in the hostilities based along the current lines of control. What they're not going to do is they're not going to give Russia territory that they've been fighting over for the last 3 years and that Russia has not been able to conquer. They're not going to give Russia territory which would give it an advantage in the almost certain event that Russia restarts this war at a later date. So, yeah, if Trump wants to be remembered as something worse than, Neville Chamberlain, waving a piece of paper saying peace in our time, then he should carry on. I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest that you could have a peace agreement to end the war without Ukraine there anyway, because Ukrainians have to agree. I've said this multiple times, but the Americans could pull all aid from Ukraine tomorrow and the Ukrainians would still continue to fight. And I think, we obviously talked about these Russian advances in Donetsk, but we have to put that in context. It's a very, very, very small advance in a very, very small section of the front in a very, very big country. It doesn't actually give Russia any kind of strategic advantage. Even taking Donetsk doesn't necessarily, in its entirety, doesn't necessarily give Russia a strategic advantage. It doesn't make the war any closer to being over for Russia because, the Ukrainians will still have the rest of Ukraine, and it's a vast country and it's got, significant manpower reserves even now, which the Ukrainians haven't mobilized by choice. So yeah, it's. I think it really demonstrates the kind of ignorance that Trump has, and also there's definitely two factions. There's two camps in the administration. You have on one side the realists. You have people like Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio, who are relatively sensible, relatively, they understand what Russia is and what Russia wants and the threat that Russia poses. And then on the other hand, you have people like Steve Witkoff and Tulsi Gabbard, who are, Witkoff is astonishingly incompetent. He should not be in his position. He has no business doing that job. And Tulsi Gabbard is essentially a Russian asset. So I think when Trump listens to these people, when he listens to Witkoff and Gabbard, his understanding of the conflict becomes skewed. And I think you can see that in his recent statements. When he listens to Rubio, when he listens to Kellogg, even when he listens to J.D. Vance, because J.D. Vance's position on the conflict was far more nuanced than, you might expect in a recent interview. He is more realistic. But again, with Trump, his opinions is very much based on the last person he speaks to, unfortunately.
Jimmy, if the conversation between Trump and Putin does come down to land, and Trump is obviously so desperate to get a deal over the line, and it would basically see Ukraine having to concede some sort of land, is there any way in which you see Ukraine agreeing to it if the US or if Europe or even both and NATO commit to long-term protection of Ukraine to avoid a third invasion?
I mean, it very much depends what they ask Ukraine to give up. What Ukraine would do is they would say, okay, de facto, Russia controls these areas. We're not going to give up our de jure claim on these areas. So we're not going to say that actually, no, in law, Russia controls these areas, but we will, accept the reality that Russia controls these areas for the time being. But they're not going to surrender parts of their country to Russia. They're still going to try and get them back. And yeah, I think for the Ukrainians, you can't just try and impose something on them which has no benefit for them. I mean, they're not idiots. They're not going to just agree to something just because the Americans tell them to do so. And I think really it's America overestimating their power. I mean, they are the most powerful country in the world, but that power has limits, and they can't just force other countries to do things that they believe is detrimental to their vital national interests. And Ukraine clearly does view that if they give a massive amount of land to Russia, especially land which gives Russia a strategic advantage in launching another invasion or continuing an invasion, it's not something they're going to agree to.
Zelensky, he tweeted that so far there is no indication whatsoever that the Russians have received signals to prepare for a post-war situation. On the contrary, they are redeploying their troops and forces in ways that suggest preparations for new offensive operations. If someone is preparing for peace, this is not what he does. So he's also urged Trump to not be misled by Putin. But Jimmy, are there ways in which that you can think that Putin would try and mislead Trump in terms of false narratives about Ukraine?
Of course. I mean, he's an ex-intelligence officer. He was 14 years or something like that in the KGB in East Germany. He absolutely understands how to spin a narrative, how to, present a false view of the world. And, look at Russian propaganda. That's how they do this sort of thing. They present a false view of the world, which is convincing enough to even if it doesn't make you believe it, it makes you question what is true. So yeah, no, he's absolutely presenting a false view of reality to Trump, and unfortunately, I think the problem with Trump is, he thinks he's on the same level as Putin. He thinks that, his real estate experience is equivalent to Putin's career in the intelligence world and in the kind of cutthroat Russian mafia and Russian political world. And it's just not, fortunately. He has no idea who he's dealing with. He thinks he's his friend still, I think. And he's not his friend. He's a brutal dictator, and he has absolutely no interest in being Donald Trump's friend. He just views him as a mark he can manipulate.
Well, when it comes to this meeting and the fact that Zelensky really wants to be there, and European leaders have urged Trump to, I guess, think of a way to get him to the table. This includes Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron. Basically, the Telegraph is now reporting that one British official has said that the concerns are unhelpful running commentary from these European leaders, and said that unlike our European colleagues, we're not publicly out there making demands of the Americans. A lot of the way the Europeans seem to be behaving, they are going to annoy the Americans. They're going to annoy Trump if they start making demands and if they put out red lines, basically saying, don't poke the bear, don't ask for more demands from Donald Trump by asking for Zelensky to be at the table, because they're clearly worried that he will flip and return to the February days where he was shouting at Zelensky in the Oval Office.
I mean, that's possible. I think, that there are some leaders that have relatively decent relationships with Trump. Starmer has a relatively decent relationship with Trump, despite their political differences. I do think it demands careful diplomacy, but at the same time, Europe has to stand up for itself. It cannot be a silent partner in this. These issues directly affect European security. So the idea that Europe is just going to, quietly acquiesce to Trump and Putin's carve up of Ukraine was never going to happen.
Jimmy, Trump's 10 to 12 day deadline for Putin was up last Friday. He didn't really mention it too much. He more so pivoted and announced that he would be having this meeting with Vladimir Putin. So an interesting take from Richard Ports, head of economics faculty at the London Business School. He told CNBC on Monday that the likelihood of an increase in sanctions pressure is significant, but given Trump's desire for a Nobel Peace Prize, the likelihood that Trump will increase these sanctions at this stage do not look very high. Do you think that Trump should be implementing these secondary sanctions, this threat that he had invoked on Putin before the meeting on Friday, almost in a way to force Putin's hand, or should it be used as a bargaining tool when they're there?
I mean, I think you could do a bit of both. There's always extra sanctions that you can apply. Again, the Russians are only going to come to the table in a realistic sense when they view the continuation of the war has been fundamentally not in their interests. And at the moment, as Zelensky pointed out, they're deploying their troops in a manner which suggests that they are preparing for more offensives. I believe that is true as well. And you see no indication they are preparing for peace. So I think the more you can damage the Russian economy, the more you can make it, less in their interest to keep fighting and more in their interest to come to terms, the more likely they are to agree to some form of peace, and the more likely Donald Trump is to get his Nobel Peace Prize, which, he's not going to get. If he sells Ukraine out, he's not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He's going to be remembered as, again, a modern version of Neville Chamberlain, probably worse, to be honest, because Neville Chamberlain at least bought some time for the UK to rearm, whereas Trump, he's really, if he does sell Ukraine out, he's doing it because he thinks it's in his own personal financial self-interest. And whatever you say about Neville Chamberlain, he wasn't motivated by, personal self-interest in that regard.
And Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you very much, Maddie.